everyone. Welcome back from lunch. 2 points, please, if I can have your attention. Dr. Wafi Momin mentioned a catalog earlier in the morning. I wanted to also show it to you. Atif, can we go to the next tab, please? Can we go to the next tab, the Special Collections catalog? Yes, that one. So the URL for that is special-collections.ias.ac.uk. It has close to 4,000 items from the special collections, including manuscripts, artifacts, books, and archives. If you'd like to consult something, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. On a related note, ISU have also been working on a video series for which we have a teaser video. DCD have worked with us on this kindly, and if you can subscribe to the IS YouTube channel, you'll keep getting more updates about it. So we can now play the videos.
Why are old manuscripts of the Quran or those of literary or doctrinal texts from different periods of our history significant? What do these manuscripts or similar cultural and artistic treasures tell us about our history and heritage? In what ways these manuscript treasures inform our understanding of the past and rectify misconceptions that may have remained dominant for centuries? And what meanings do these treasures hold for members of the Ismaili communities and inform their sense of identity and rootedness in history? If you are curious to know about these questions, then join us on this journey of exploring manuscript and artistic treasures from the Ismaili Special Collections unit. In this video series, scholars will explore select artifacts pertaining to specific themes in our history and unpack their scholarly significance. We are delighted to bring these manuscripts and artifacts to a wider audience in our first ever video series here at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, London.
Thank you, everyone. Delighted to be chairing the last panel of the day. Obviously, we have a discussion after this, but this is the last panel, which is on contemporary Ismailism. This is part 2, and we've got our 4 speakers here. We start with Dr. Zamira Dilborbekova, who's going to talk about, or her topic is When the Local Meets the Transnational, an analysis of the Ismaili reunion in Tajikistan, 1985 to 1995. Zamira, your time starts now.
Right. Okay. Just check it. Oh. Good afternoon, evening, morning to everyone. My name is Zamira, and in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to be talking to you on the topic of the Ismaili reunion in Tajikistan in late Soviet and early Soviet, post-Soviet period. So, can I have my slides up? All right. So I'll begin by setting the scene, and we'll move on to talk you through various events and developments at the time before I conclude by problematizing very briefly some of the approaches in the development in the field. So let's start. The reunion of the Shia Imami Ismaili community in Tajikistan with their spiritual leader, His Highness Dargah Khan IV, and the global Ismaili community after 70 years of Soviet isolation marked a turning point in Tajik Ismaili history. Amidst the rapidly expanding literature or scholarship on Islam in post-Soviet Central Asia, this topic remains sparsely documented, and both in local and wider academic literature. The Ismaili community of Tajikistan, just a brief reminder, is a prominent and distinct ethno-cultural, linguistic, and religious minority group, also referred to as Pamiris. The community is comprised of about 250,000 inhabitants, approximately 3% of the Tajikistan total population, that resides predominantly in a remote and geographically isolated mountainous region of Gorno-Badakhshan of Tajikistan. Moving on, this research considered a few conceptual frameworks, really, such as the paradigm of multiple modernities by Eisenstadt, to really capture, among other aspects, the dynamic nature and interaction between Islam and modernity that cross-fertilize and transform one another critically and creatively. I use Assad's notion of Islamic discursive tradition to emphasize the idea of a dialogue with the sources of authority, and in this case of the Ismailis, their constant engagement and interpretation and reinterpretation of the Imam's guidance in line with the tradition. Oral history theory was also considered as a source of interdisciplinary research, with the appreciation that memory of the war can form not only an essential part of identity, but its traumatic experiences able to reduce anything which occurred before or after to a generalization. Collected between 2009 and 2012, this research is based on oral history, occasional local sources preserved in private collections, online and local newspaper archives, and textual analysis of the pronouncements of the Aga Khan in the form of farmans, decrees, and speeches from that period. The vast forms of local narratives and discourses have been used to reconstruct the past which is fading away from the local memory. These narratives also revealed perceptions, local perceptions, attitudes, which contributed to shaping later developments within the community. To begin with, local memories and most of the literature often link the initiation of the Ismaili reunion in Tajikistan with the commencement of the humanitarian relief to Gorno-Badakhshan under the auspices of the Aga Khan agencies, which followed the outbreak of the civil war in the country in 1992 and a 6-month economic blockade by the central government on the region heavily dependent on external provision. In turn, I claim that the story of reunion predates the civil war and was not as abrupt as perceived by many. In what follows, I'll set the scene and discuss the parallel or disconnected developments at local and transnational level in late Soviet period before I move on to explore their early encounters. A religious and cultural revival among the Ismailis in Tajikistan, or Pamiris, was exhilarated by reforms of glasnost and openness and perestroika social restructuring, initiated by new Soviet leader Gorbachev in 1985. On the one hand, you see, instigated by this idea of cultural and religious renaissance among Tajiks, this revival took very nationalistic character among Pamiri intelligentsia in country's capital, Dushanbe. They participated widely and actively in nationalist movements, expressing their ideas largely through the agendas of political parties, such as Rastakha's Awakening, the Democratic Party of Tajikistan, and Lali Badakhshan, the Ruby of Badakhshan. Their agendas, with exclusion of Lali Badakhshan, who claimed an autonomous status of the region, were generally directed at building a collective image of a Tajik nation based on democratic principles. This revival, however, was short-lived, as it came to be curtailed by the outbreak of the civil war in 1992 and mass killings of the opposition to the incumbent communist government, which included numbers of Pamiris who failed to flee the capital and its surrounding areas to take refuge in Gorno-Badakhshan or outside the country. On the other hand, in Gorno-Badakhshan, Gorbachev reforms encouraged the revival of the local Ismaili tradition. Khalifas, the only extant local religious authority for the Tajik Ismailis since the Soviet era, came to play an outspoken role in reviving cultural and religious ideas and practices. Mado, devotional poetry recitation, with elucidation of its meaning, was fully reintroduced into religious ceremonies and community gatherings. Stories of encounters with the Aga Khan III and his envoys to Badakhshan, formerly confined to limited or narrow circles only, began to resurface. Reference to honorific titles, tracing a family lineage to prominent local religious leaders and representatives of the past, such as Pir Zoda, Mir Zoda, Said Zoda, began to feature more frequently in everyday local discourses. Besides, the rediscovery of a few original or transcribed early farmans of Sultan Muhammad Shah, Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah, from the pre-Soviet period, kept hidden safe from the Soviet regime, were boosting the esteem of their owners. Works of Nasir Khusrau and Sufi thinkers, used by the locals to explicate the Ismaili teachings, were cited not only at dawats, religious gatherings, but at official educational and academic events. And these are just some developments at the time. What I'd like to say is that, akin to the developments in the capital, the Ismaili revival in the region unfolded independent from transnational Ismaili processes. Yet, both local and transnational processes were directed at re-establishing mutual contacts, I claim, to explicate. At transnational level, the earliest prospect directed at reunion can be traced at least to the times when the Aga Khan residence, Maison de Saussure, I hope I pronounced it correctly, was reportedly offered as a venue for the historic event of the Geneva summit between the world leaders, the pro-liberal, reform-inspired Gorbachev, and the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, who met for the first time since the Cold War period in that building. Moreover, the Aga Khans voiced the prospects of reunion with the Afghan and Tajik Jamaats in his Farman issued in Tanzania in October 1988. Since then, the notions of unity, diversity, and later pluralism were reiterated in Farmans consistently. Furthermore, in 1990s, one of the Imamat institutions, the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, commenced work with authorities of Uzbekistan in support of the revitalization project for the old city of Samarkand. On 17 September 1992, the Aga Khan was received in Tashkent by President of Uzbekistan to host the 5th Aga Khan Award for Architecture ceremony. This event was meant but failed to be attended by the local Ismaili delegation traveling from Tajikistan due to Uzbekistan's sudden border closures in response to the conflict outbreak in Tajikistan. Only 2 high-profile representatives, both of Pamiri origin, reportedly made it. Earlier than that, few locals would recall at all the visit of Sayyid Mansour Nadiri, a prominent Ismaili leader of Baghlan province of Afghanistan, to Gorno-Badakhshan in November 1990, when the latter, according to the several eyewitness accounts, crossed the Afghan river border at Tem village of Horg. In the presence of the Russian security officers, he was received and escorted by the local governor, first to meet the prominent late Khalifa Shoei Kalon in Porsheniv, and then escorted to Pamir restaurant in Horog, where he met with local government officials, Khalifas, informal leaders, and some other members of the community. At the meeting, Nadiri spoke about the Aga Khan, and allegedly he received 2 letters by the locals for the Aga Khan, which contained or reinstated their allegiance to the Imam. While there is no evidence to suggest that Nadiri was sent to Gorno-Badakhshan on the Aga Khan's request, it's plausible to think that the letter sent by him may have reached the Aga Khan. In December 1990s, according to late Ali Muhammad Rajput, the Aga Khan had a discussion with Nadiri about his visit to Gorno-Badakhshan. And that's an interview with Rajput cited in one of the local publications from 1998. Moving on, another little-known encounter with the Aga Khan's representative was a visit of late Rajput to Dushanbe in March 1991. He initially spent 2 months in early 1991 in Afghanistan with Nadiri before being escorted by the latter to Tajikistan. As per my interview with late Rajput, during his 20-day stay in Dushanbe, he addressed small audiences and met with some prominent representatives of Pamiri diaspora. He could not travel to Badakhshan at the time for reasons of escalating instability on the Tajik-Afghan border, and he had returned to England. Subsequently, Rajput arrived to Gorno-Badakhshan with 2 other representatives, Rafiq Kasherji and Saeed Jalal Badakhshani, in June 1991, when they were received with huge enthusiasm from the locals. With the escalation of the political turmoil in the country, the Aga Khan's representatives began to promote a pro-peace agenda at various gatherings with the community. Despite those, it was too short a period for those to be able to avert the involvement of parts of the community in the rapidly escalating conflict, made irreversible, particularly by the involvement of the external powers, Russia and Uzbekistan in particular, and rapid militarization of the forces along the regional loyalties. Next, although military actions did not carry out in Gordo-Badakhshan itself, it was arguably a region worst affected by the civil war. Since autumn 1992, about 45 to 60,000 refugees entered the region, which suffered acute food shortage and psychological distress caused by the death toll and humanitarian crisis. In this environment, humanitarian relief under the auspices of the AKF, supported by the international consortium of donors, began to stream into the region via Osh in Kyrgyzstan in March 1993. With the government support, AKF set up an NGO, Pamiri Relief Development Program, PRDP, which some may remember, with its base in Horok, Gorno-Badakhshan. These developments, as a result, came to be largely perceived and stayed in the memory of the locals as the first indirect encounter with the Aga Khan. The humanitarian relief was not at all spontaneous, though, again, as perceived by many. The regional relief program was conceived in summer 1992, before this outbreak of the civil war, for part of the population, which enabled to preform formal relationship with the government in Dushanbe, as well as Kyrgyz and Russian authorities. At the same time, the instigation of a dialogue by the Aga Khan with the central Tajik authorities and the promotion of peace led to critical developments in state-Ismaili relations. For instance, in October 1993, the then vice head of Supreme Court, Shuroy Uli, of Pamiri origin, he flew to Geneva to represent both the government of Tajikistan and the local Ismaili community at an audience with the Aga Khan. During the meeting, he handed a letter from President Rahmon, dated from 10th October 1993, to the Aga Khan. Through these developments, Khalifas, a traditional religious body of authority, came to acquire significant and yet largely apolitical role at the time, whilst playing an active role in religious revitalization in late Soviet period. Khalifas' role during the civil war extended from being ritual performers to turning into dynamic social religious agents and intermediaries between the Aga Khan and the local, his messaging and the local community. With the outbreak of the civil war, Khalifas continued to perform rituals, albeit on a much greater scale. The rising demand for Khalifa services, driven by the escalating numbers of the dead and refugees entering the region, eventually led to increase in numbers of the Khalifa assistants, many of whom in 1998, by the appointment of the Ismaili Tariqa Religious Education Committee, ITREC, and being registered with the local government, came to constitute the official body of Khalifas in Gordo-Badakhshan. Apart from this, Khalifas tried to address moral and psychological distress and give hope to the families of the deceased and the Jamaat in general, as per the Imam's guidance. Their messages relied extensively and transmitted the essence of the Aga Khan's guidance, conveyed via his representatives and his Irshad Mubarak from 1993, as known locally London Mulaqat, which I discuss shortly. We observe through this period a shifting role of the sources of religious authority, from teachings and sayings of Nasir Khosraw and Sufi intellectuals and al farmans employed widely by Khalifas and the learned Jamaati members, to the primary reliance on the contemporary direct guidance coming from the Aga Khan. As a result, the engagement with the Imam's guidance gradually came to shift the perceptions and attitudes of the locals towards the conflict and their relations with the state. London Mulaqat is one of the earliest events and sources of guidance produced for the Tajik Jamaat community. In November 1993, 8 representatives of the Tajik Jamaat had an audience with the Aga Khan at the Ismaili Center in London. When they were received Irshad, when when they received the Shad Mubarak that provided directives on the spiritual and temporal matters, reiterated in later farmans for the Tajik and indeed global Jamaats. Embedded in broader principles of Islam on the one hand, the guidance emphasized some of the key Ismaili teachings, such as the central authority of the Imam and his prerogative in matters of interpretation of both religious and temporal for his worldwide community. The balance between the spiritual and the worldly aspects, the din and dunya, the intimate nature of the relationship between faith and intellect, and the importance of ethics and ethical conduct in Islam. The Imam also highlighted at the audience the significance of religious education in filling in the vacuum created since the Soviet inclusion. Moreover, the Jamaat was advised about future encounters and interactions with the Ismailis from around the world, guiding them to embrace diversity and pluralism. On the other hand, Irshad Mubarak spoke to his Jamaat Murids, Tajik Murids, on their role in improving social and political conditions in the country, stressing the ethics of forgiveness, bakshandagi, and brotherhood, barodari or ukhuwat. In Islam, the Aga Khan called upon his murids to return to peace. Issues arising in societies, he noted, were to be resolved through dialogue as opposed to violence. Next, the first news of the Aga Khan's arrival or intention to visit Tajikistan reached the community in late January 1995, when his 5-day visit to Moscow, after his 5-day visit to Moscow on an invitation from the Russian government. During this trip, he met with some senior Russian officials and visited the Institute for Oriental Studies to explore possibilities of collaboration. And on 29 January 1995, the Aga Khan held a mulaqat known as Moscow Mulaqat with 25 representatives from Gorno-Badakhshan, including Jamaati leaders, Khalifas, and reciters of Maddo. The formal reunion of the Aga Khan with his followers in Tajikistan was solemnized at the Didar in May 1995, a historic moment of the first ever Imam's visit in history of Badakhshan on the land of Gorno-Badakhshan. The visit furthered his positive cooperation with the central government, his institutional involvement in the socio-economic and religious life of his murids in Tajikistan, and the centralization and institutionalization of the Ismaili faith and tradition in the region. Subsequently, 35 Jamaati representatives from across Gorno-Badakhshan were oriented to help prepare the Jamaat for the forthcoming Didar. This could be viewed as one of the first experiences of being introduced to transnational protocols and ethics of Imam-Murid relations or interactions developed outside the local Ismaili tradition. During the Aga Khan's visit, the agenda of peace building continued to be top of the list, including at Didars, meetings with local authorities and government representatives. For that purpose, the Aga Khan met in private, first with Khalifas, and after with local military commanders and informal leaders. At the meeting with Khalifas, the message of the peace was reiterated, and they were also warned of the forthcoming transformations in the local religious structure and practices. Whereas little is known about the content of the closed-door meetings with the military commanders, allegedly, the Aga Khan urged them to revert to peace and talk them out of further bloodshed and fighting. Local media and publication became a significant source of information, projecting profound trends in the Ismaili religious renewal in the early phase of their reunion. Those were the local TV channel and radio programs, newspaper Badakhshan and Marifat, journal and booklet publications, which included voices of Khalifas, learned individuals, subject experts, the Aga Khan's institutional representatives, both local and expatriates, local government officials, and other prominent leaders and figures from within the community. Reflecting the means available and relevant to Pamiris at the time, arguably highly Soviet in nature, those allowed to trace the continuity and change in local developments, attitudes, and perceptions, featuring an array of genres Those were used as powerful, wide-reaching, and effective means of educating and keeping the community informed on various aspects of their faith and workings on the ground. Some genres I cite are of the published material contained various scholarly and journalist articles related to Ismaili teachings, personal narratives of Ismaili encounters within and outside the country with local and transnational Ismaili representatives, learnings about the Aga Khan and the Imamat institutional structure. Remember, we never had that experience. Updates on humanitarian relief and workings on the grounds by the Aga Khan and government officials, providing a considerable amount of transparency and accountability around the work of these institutions. I mean, you would have reports of number of lorries entered, how many kgs per person, and everything. It was absolutely mind-blowing to find the details in those archives. So, despite possible inaccuracies, media and publications revealed deep significance and enthusiasm among the Tajik Ismailis about the re-established contacts with the Aga Khan and transnational Ismaili community. These efforts aim to fill in the gap created by parallel historical trajectories they went through since the Soviet inclusion. And finally, the paper contributes to the argument that faith can play a transformative power and role in peace building and reconstruction of social order. It's one of the growing fields, by the way, in the literature. It's essential, however, to be mindful if government, institutions, and institutional and societal efforts are directed at contributing to a positive or lasting peace, as opposed to negative peace, entailing the absence of direct violence, that tend to be hidden in societal structures such as juridical systems. The latter ones, the negative piece, tends to lead in the long run to devastating results in post-conflict developing societies. Moreover, research on aid effectiveness raises concerns about those or aid stabilizing autocratic states, which over the time become less committed to democratic change and accountability. Additionally, like in a number of post-conflict settings globally, states and other actors tend to adopt a narrow and negative connotation of the term political, leading societies to disengage with politics, contributing to less democratic systems of governance. So revisiting or visiting these arguments is critical to contribute to self-reliance of communities in the long run, including in Gorda Parasha. Thank you. I had to be very brief on many developments, so I know many people in the audience will have more to say around those, so please talk to me. I'd like to enter those events as well into the timeline I have, but I couldn't cover all as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Zamira. We now have Dr. Fayaz Alibhai, whose topic is the Ismaili Heritage Project and Introduction.
So reports of this being the graveyard shift have been grossly exaggerated. Thank you. Nobody else got it, but it's fine.
You need a British sense of humor for that.
Clearly.
We have graves in Canada too.
You can fall asleep, Karim. No one's going to. You've done your bit. I want to begin by adding my thanks to Dr. Daftari, Darius, Julia, Notion, the IT staff, Atif and Sam, and all of the volunteers, and indeed all of those visibly and invisibly involved in putting together this conference. It is a treat and privilege to be here, thank you, and to share with you for the first time publicly the work of the Ismaili Heritage Project. This is a presentation in two parts, and I'd like first to make some introductory remarks before going on to provide an overview of the Ismaili Heritage Project, encompassing its origins, history and development, the scope of our work, and our progress over the last 7 years. Overall, I hope to illustrate how we are seeking and pioneering a fresh way to behold our history and understand our contributions to material culture. Specifically, I hope to demonstrate the importance of the IH project, not merely generally and in the abstract, but particularly and practically, and in continual reference to the project's guiding principles as envisioned and articulated by the present Imam of the Ismailis. On 19th November 1256, almost exactly 766 years ago, last week, Ruknuddin Khurshad, the 27th Ismaili Imam and 8th and final Lord of Alamut, descended from the castle of Maimundiz and surrendered to the Mongols. On the Imam's orders, Alamut submits a week later. The Mongols take over, destroying Ismaili castles, fortresses, settlements, and villages, burning libraries, murdering thousands. A year later, the Imam himself is murdered by his Mongol minders. Not for the first time in Ismaili history, the succeeding Imams and the community go into hiding en masse for the next 200 years before feeling secure enough to emerge in what is known as the Anjudan revival. Hiding, as the naturalist, poet, and philosopher David Whyte has noted, is a way of staying alive, a way of holding ourselves until we are ready to come into the light. So far, so she, so very Ismaili. But he goes further. Whyte observes that hiding is an act of freedom from the misunderstanding of others, especially in the enclosing world of oppressive secret government and private entities, attempting to name us, to anticipate us, to leave us with no place to hide and grow in ways unmanaged by a creeping necessity for absolute naming, absolute tracking, and absolute control. Hiding is a bid for independence from others, from mistaken ideas we have about ourselves, from an oppressive and mistaken wish to keep us completely safe, completely ministered to, and therefore completely managed. Hiding is creative, necessary, and beautifully subversive of outside interference and control. Hiding leaves life to itself to become more of life itself. And he concludes by saying that hiding is the radical independence necessary for our emergence into the light of a proper human future. And I think in the context of some of the stuff that Karim was talking about for Alamut, stuff that's going on in China, for example, and all of the other stuff we have spoken about over the last couple of days, this remains a really powerful idea from a completely non-Islamic context. As we have seen, much of our hiding is intertwined with our history and heritage, and the sacking of Alamut is perhaps one of the most obvious and enduring examples. It is interesting, therefore, to observe that as much as the community admires and is proud of the work of the Arkan Development Network, its wider projects involving culture, heritage, and leisure are often quietly perceived as soft, divorced from, and irrelevant to their immediate needs. There is more to be said about this, but for now I'd like only to point to the many speeches, interviews, and other articulations of the present Ismaili Imam that puncture this perception or otherwise address and append this internal community narrative, and that book there is a key example. Why is heritage important? Heritage is not about fetishizing the past, it's about how we understand the past through the lens of our present and prepare ourselves and our children for the future. Much of what we do at the IIS may be classified as heritage work, although we don't normally or explicitly talk about it as such. The Ismaili Heritage Project is one of several such heritage-related work, but perhaps the least known, at least until today. Other heritage work may be seen in the long-standing work and textual collections of the Arkan Library and the Ismaili Special Collections Unit, as well as in the research and publications of the Central Asian Studies Unit, as we saw this morning, developments in the newly formed South Asian Studies Unit, and most recently, the initiation of the Oral History Project. The Ismaili Heritage Project's mandate is to focus on the built heritage of the community. In his anthology of poetry, Stony Limits and Other Poems, Hugh McDermott writes of there being plenty of ruined buildings in the world, but no ruined stones. It's a powerful line because it speaks not only of our transience, but also to see, really see, our limited place, our short human story in the considerably longer history of the world. This becomes even clearer in the lines that follow. What happens to us is irrelevant to the world's geology, but what happens to the world's geology is not irrelevant to us. And I cite this poem for the obvious relevance of heritage in the context of COP27, the climate change conference that has just come to a close in Egypt. Again, there is more to be said about this critical issue, and we will be privileged soon, I hope, to hear more about this field of study at the IIS through the work of colleagues like Qudsiya, who is sitting right in front of me. Returning to the poem, it highlights our human role not as masters of creation, but as subjects to it. This idea, and I'd go so far as to call it an ethic, resonates strongly with several ideas and ethics important to the Ismailis and as members of a wider Shia Muslim community. The first, of course, is the idea of us as stewards, custodians, guardians of the gifts of creation, as well as of the lessons of history. We accept, learn, and pass these on to the generations that come after. The second idea this line speaks to in our context is that of our own political and monumental history. So not only the Fatimid period in North Africa and Egypt, and the Almohad period in Iran and Syria which follow, but also of all the edifices that these two major phases in our history generated or are otherwise associated with. Cities, castles, cemeteries, forts, mosques, mausolea, palaces, libraries, universities, and other centers of learning, shrines, villages, residences are just a few examples. The third related idea is about the relative value we tend to place on buildings versus stones. Some of you know from Ali Hassani's work how important it is to be mindful of Islam in the singular with a capital I and of Islams in the plural with a lowercase I. And this is, of course, an old dichotomy between high culture and lower popular culture, of canon versus practice, urban versus rural, and so on. And of the resulting perception that one is better, purer, truer than the other, and therefore more worthy of study, inquiry, attention, and yes, money. Budgets, as we know, are important. Note to all of you sitting here ahead of tomorrow's meeting. It's an internal joke. It's not a coincidence that all of these points dovetail with the guiding principles articulated by the present Nizari Ismaili Imam on Ismaili heritage, which the project has collated, and some of which you will see shortly. Every single major decision we have taken on the project since its inception goes back to these principles. Why heritage? This is His Highness speaking at the inauguration of the restored gardens at Humayun's tomb in April 2003. He says, "The disappearance of physical traces of the past deprives us of more than memories. How do we protect the past and inspire the future?" We have seen increasing geopolitical conflict over the last 10 years, rising tension between countries and peoples of Sunni, Shia, and indeed other beliefs. Material culture is often the first casualty of war and conflict. Destroy this and you begin erasing the histories and identities of not just individuals, but communities and nations. But even where conflict is not an issue, sometimes just simple access is. Coupled with a lack of knowledge and understanding of our history, this heritage is coming under threat by neglect, willful destruction, and, as I mentioned earlier, already climate change. So let's turn to a short history of the project. It was first proposed in 2007 as a Golden Jubilee initiative, but didn't get off the ground because of the sheer volume of things happening then. It was revived in 2011 when the beginnings of a database were created and information on various sites began to be collated. Version 3 was constituted in 2014 and submitted formally to His Highness in January 2015. In all its incarnations, however, it was always envisaged as a truly joint project, and I think it's the only long-standing intellectual sustained collaboration between these three institutions to date, and that is the Archon Trust for Culture in Geneva, the IS here in London, and the Ismaili community as represented by the Department of Jamaati Institutions in Lisbon and the Leaders International Forum, the LIF. As soon as it got the green light, the clock began ticking, and as many of you know, in institutional terms, this can mean only one thing. So the pressure was on immediately. At budget meeting shortly after a revised proposal was put to His Highness, he asked when it would be ready, and then what we would like to do with these buildings, so a very practical application of this. The key question we had to ask ourselves was, to what end? What were we trying to achieve? And so we went back to the guidance His Highness had given over the intervening years. This is what he said. We would legitimize the symbols of our history and legitimate the Shia in the country. This is very important. We need an encyclopedic record. Don't miss important buildings. We need a sense of pride in these regions, of the presence of the Shia Ismailis in history. There is a real purpose. Some of these buildings no longer belong to us and others no longer exist. A study needs to be undertaken to identify which ones are damaged, which do not exist, and which ones will never come back to us. And there's an element of forgetting here that is part of another paper that I shall do at another point in time. Are they invaded by down-market environments, and should we let them disappear, or do we bring them into our modern history? Once restored, how many would lend themselves to reutilization, by whom, and for what purpose? And finally, our young people want to see sites and buildings in our history and take pride in our heritage. But what kind of heritage are we talking about? As you can see, the examples map rather neatly onto the institutions that we know and love, with movable and intangible heritage falling within the remit of the IIS, the Archon Music Initiative, and the Archon Museum, and of course immovable heritage as part of the mandate of AKTC and its various programs. And so what we realized is that His Highness was looking at something much, much larger. So what do we do? Our tasks were clear. We needed to comprehensively map sites important to Ismaili history and culture, and to input this research into an online database. This sounds simple enough, but how do we do it systematically? So the first thing we did was to argue a lot. Diversity may be strength, but nobody said it was easy, least of all His Highness. As institutional partners, each of us brought with us ways of thinking and approaching problems that were innate to the institutions we represented. Overcoming those assumptions and unconscious biases to create something entirely new has been both humbling and exciting in equal measure. And I should point out that many of these institutional positions we had were not necessarily personal positions that we might have had. They just were imposed on us because we represented the IS text, AKTC, buildings, DJI. Where is it? We needed it yesterday. So we questioned what we needed, and we developed draft fields for the database, mapping and testing fields proposed for the IH project with those on ArchNet, which many of you will be familiar with. We then developed authority records, which is a library science term referring to standardized database entries. These entries function as key entry points for bibliographic and contextual information, and they bring consistency to the variety of ways in which people may search for unique database entry. And a quick example would be that we would want to make sure that a search term for Prince Charles would generate the same results for now King Charles, or that a search for Coke Studio gives you the Pakistani television program and not some dodgy drug den. I was just checking whether you guys were still awake or not. I should point out that none of these terms or figures are on a database yet. What we did want on the database were authority records for the Ismaili Imams. An easier way to think of these is that they are essentially biographies of the Imams. They are very brief, highly structured, and descriptive, and they lie at the very heart of the database because they are linked to individual Ismaili sites. We have Dr. Daftary's massive book on the Ismailis, now in its second edition, and we have his more accessible short history. The preliminary biographies we compiled at the beginning of the project, however, with Dr. Daftary's generous help, were designed to be perhaps the shortest history ever, with just over 49 pages long for 49 Imams. The ideas and that didn't happen, incidentally, but close enough. The ideas and thinking around these biographies led directly to what I think was one of the IS's most exciting publications in 2020, which is Dr. Daftary's The Ismaili Imams, A Biographical History. These biographies form the scaffolding upon which each site in the database can be directly linked, so that we can relate Ismaili sites to the authority figures responsible for the creation, development, and patronage of those sites. In other words, these biographies will also function as key entry points, as I said earlier, bringing consistency to the multiple ways in which people may search this database. Next, we wanted to consolidate and review the existing lists of sites and extensive associated data collated specifically for the project over the years through the dedicated efforts of people like Alnur Merchant, who is right there, and Zamira Dilborbekova, and others who worked on this project on its infancy. This includes some 170 different documents, not including images. We also wanted to incorporate relevant data from ArchNet. So these are records, publications, images, and videos of sites such as AKDN buildings and developments and the Ismaili centers. And finally, we needed to reference all of this information and create a general bibliography on Ismaili heritage sites, including sources researched or otherwise documented and catalogued by IIS, AKTC, and others. Now, I've left out a key element here. How do we define Ismaili sites? At the inception of this project, we had estimated that there would be around 400 sites worldwide that the project would need to map and document. This ballpark figure was arrived at by defining IH sites only as those directly and obviously related to the history of the Imams, e.g. the Fatimid cities in North Africa and the associated edifices there, as well as sites in Iran and Syria, as I mentioned earlier. In light of subsequent preliminary research, we revisited His Highness's initial guidance and determined that given the project's aims and encyclopedic remit, the criteria for identifying and defining the sites should be expanded as follows. Category A are sites of obvious historical relevance for the parts they've played in Ismaili history. So these are the cities, castles, forts, mosques, villages, palaces, libraries, residences, etc. Category B are sites that have meaning and significance for Ismailis in the modern period. So these are Jamaat Khanas, Ismaili centers, tombs, mausolea, shrines, cemeteries, pilgrimage routes, and so on and so forth. And this includes, of course, towns and cities as well. For completeness' sake, we had also considered a third criterion, namely modern AKTN buildings and institutions, hospitals, schools, industrial plants, tourist facilities, etc. These are not a focus for IH at the moment because of their obvious affiliation and contemporary documentation. And so we focused on well-known category A sites, such as the magnificent castles and ruins of the Alamut and Rudbar regions of Iran. And we have also focused on lesser-known category B sites of hyper-local shrines constituted entirely of stone in far-flung villages in Tajikistan. Ditto sites such as the Mumbai Darkhana or the Al Khan Park in Toronto. Now, what data we collect is guided by constant reference to His Highness's guiding principles, specific queries he has made, and existing best practice. And these are a few examples of the type of data we are trying to collect. You'll see an example of this a little bit later, but fairly comprehensive stuff and really detailed. So, 7 years later, what have we got done? 1,357 sites identified across 55 different countries. This slide illustrates the scale and scope of the work. Some countries were too small to be seen on the map, so I've left out the Comoros and the Reunion Islands. These are normally on the map, but I have to do this every time, and I can't see it at times. So, red represents countries with undocumented sites. Green represents countries that have been documented or are in progress. Now, it may look like there's a long way to go, and there is, but remember that the number and size of the countries in red does not necessarily correspond to the number and density of those countries in green. So in fact, you can see at the bottom over there, we have now documented about 61% of sites across 23 countries, which is more than half of the countries we've identified. And one of our ongoing problems is we keep identifying new sites. So every year, I keep having to push back as to when we will actually finish the project. So remember the guiding principles articulated by His Highness, that the work should be encyclopedic in the sense of its scope and scale, as well as its academic credibility. In turn, that would help to validate Shi'i voices and understand our contributions to Islamic civilization. In turn, this enables us to legitimize and take pride in the symbols of our history, and this becomes then another way to understand, promote, safeguard Ismaili history, heritage, and identity as Shia Imami Ismaili Muslims. So here's the example of the Great Mosque of Sarmin. There are 3 sections there: the historical context, inscriptions, and translations, and there's a site description as well. There are footnotes too. We are at the Institute, so you can't see them in the screenshot, but trust me, they are there and they drive us bananas. We also include author information and location information, like any good reference or source, and we keep a record of who's written this material, when it was last modified in its current status. So here's the author reference. HH over there is not His Highness, it is actually Haytham Hassan. Just thought I'd point that out quickly. We also indicate where these are located. So you have actual street addresses and geolocation data, so you can then go back to Google Maps and see it automatically in its geopolitical context. These are all of the different tabs that are available, and these map onto the fields we said earlier. And I can see Laila flapping her papers, so I shall carry on very quickly. But you can see how these zoom in over there, and we can talk about some of that in a bit more detail. That was just the data tab. We also have the media tab, the publications tab, and the events tab, and they all function in exactly the same way and will get populated in the same way. So this Great Mosque of Sarmin is just one example. We have 827 others already on the database in various stages of documentation. Now, none of this work would have been possible without some amazing people, most of whom are in this room, and these folk as well, my researchers. Their counsel, their knowledge, their expertise, their experience, their passion has been integral to developing this project over the past 7 years since this project's re-inception. It has been a labor of love, some sweat, and like everything that is meaningful and important in all our lives, even a few tears. Yes, maybe more than a few. I also want to acknowledge the massive efforts of an amazing TKN team of database volunteer experts who have spent 2 years working with us on developing the database that showcases the work of this project. And because of all of these people and all the people who came before us, whom I've mentioned earlier, we have a powerful database not only to explore Ismaili heritage, but also a solid and accessible base to talk about our history and our contributions to material culture. These are the stats. I wanted to show you, aside from the country documentation, the actual number of sites that we've documented. These are figures from about 2 weeks ago. Add 20 to that since then. I'm skipping over all of this. End bit. So what? This is why. So at the highest level, we have direction and vision from His Highness. At the lowest level, we are putting in the work, preparing the ground for seed and planting, and we are working with others to test the database and explore how our work can be better when we work together. At the IS, these include my remarkable colleagues at the Ismaili Special Collections Unit, the Archival Library, the Department of Curriculum Studies, and beyond also Global Encounters, all of whom are partners with us. So what are we growing for the communities we are responsible for and their institutions? These are just some of our, I hate calling these outputs, but just early examples of some of the kinds of things we are doing. Am I done?
Yes.
I shall stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Fayaz. We have our next speaker, Dr. Maryam Razaee, who's going to talk about higher education and Iranian Ismaili women's empowerment.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me for this program, for this seminar. I thought that I'm the last one. I told Zamira that I'm the last one, but I was sitting relaxed and listening. So my paper is completely different from whatever you have heard from day one. And I'm really happy that this opportunity was given to me by Dr. Dariush and Dr. Daftari and invited me to present this. You may not be interested, but because it's very contemporary, but please listen to it because this I will try to pass the message of many Ismaili women who actually I interviewed and they would like to know how they are and under what circumstances they are living in Iran. So, by the way, before I start, I have many presentations. I had many presentations in my classes, and it has not been very difficult. But today, whenever I'm looking at it and see so many scholars here in this room, it's really difficult to talk. Please bear with me, and I'm so sorry if I do some mistakes or my voice, you can already hear that is shaking. I start with, I know I'm losing my time, but they said that in Persian we have got a proverb. They said that somebody has said that go and it's easy to talk. So go and just say that in the morning you had paneer and angur. And paneer means cheese and angur means grape. So he went there and he said that in the morning I had anir and pangur. So just change this. So I hope I'm not presenting that way anyway. So anyway, in this paper, I will try to bridge a gap in research that exists about the invisibility of Ismaili women in tertiary education in Iran. The central concern of this paper is to explore what are the socio-political barriers placed on Ismaili women's way towards tertiary education, how they were tackled, and what is the linkage between tertiary education and women's status of empowerment. In order to give you a better understanding or a little bit of background, I would like to briefly tell you a little bit of historical background of tertiary education in Iran and then Ismailis in particular. Up to the last decade of the 19th century, the vast majority of Iranian women led narrow, restricted, powerless lives. They were absent from the public domain and isolated at home. There was a women's world of child rearing, housekeeping, and social and religious rituals, but women were most often key members of the households. However, after that, following the contact with the West and a sense that Iran had fallen behind the European powers in economic, military, and technological strength, some Iranian officials and intellectuals proposed reforms. The idea of improving the condition of women was proposed by some reformists. They emphasized education and its extension. They stressed the need to establish schools for girls as well as boys. In 1935, during the reign of Reza Khan, Iran's first university opened its door to both men and women. The aim of the university was to create a cadre of professionals as a means of westernizing Iran and promoting modernization while suppressing Islam. Mohammad Reza followed Reza Khan's educational agenda to modernize Iran. After the World War II, Iran continued its rigorous emphasis on education. The education that Pahlavi promoted was secular, nationalistic, and Western in form and content. Between 1963 and the early 1970s, oil revenue gave the Iranian economy its first dramatic boom. The rapid growth in the economy expanded the size of government, which in turn increased the need for highly educated civil servants. In Iran, whose ancient history already exalted education, the magic and the myth of education became even more powerful during the quest for modernization. The high regard for education was a common thread through Iranian society. The rural populace saw it as a way to better life. The middle class saw education as the only means toward upper social and economic mobility, and the upper class considered higher education the way to secure their status quo. Prior to the Islamic Revolution, female enrollment in university reached a peak of almost 31%. The high rate of women's enrollment in tertiary education was regarded as evidence of women's advancement under the Shah. However, vast number of women were not presented in this statistic. These figures conceal the many women who remained either illiterate or outside educational system. Most of these women typically were traditional and religious families, coming from religious family who choose not to go to secular schools. Very Ismaili women were in that area. Although it might be argued that prior to the Islamic Revolution, the Pahlavi's education agenda emplaced only a small portion of women from urban upper and middle class family, it was not the case with the Ismailis. Due to religious beliefs and Imam's farman, rural and urban Ismailis, the poor and the wealthy, upper and middle class families, as well as the working class, made very good effort to educate their children. Those who had access to school sent their kids to school, and those who either did not have access to the state school or due to the traditional culture were not willing to set their children out to the city, sent their kids to either maktab or Kat Khoda's house to learn how to read and write by reading the Quran. Therefore, except for Ismaili's commitment to education, I can argue that before the Islamic Revolution, Ismaili's women's position as Iranian has been very much the same as other Iranian, including the Twelvers. All women were regarded as Iranian in the first place, and no distinction was made between various religions, and religious was personal, and whatever applied to others applied to Ismailis too. So now one may say that, okay, then what's the issue with Ismailis? Issue arise after Islamic Revolution. Soon after revolution, in June 1979, the government dismissed all female judges and prevented female law students from entering into this position. They were denied access to certain occupations that were considered male-oriented, particularly those occupants that required extensive fieldwork, such as mining and petrol engineering. One of the Pahlavi's early demand was the independence of university from the states. However, the new rulers' aim was to extend Islamic state control over the universities. As a result, they reformed the whole system, replacing the old pre-revolution value system with the new one, in an attempt to build an ideal society based on Islamic criteria. The need for a cultural revolution to Islamize higher education was felt and was voiced by authorities. In April 98, Ayatollah Khomeini appointed a board of Islamic educational experts to investigate all programs and problems concerning education, to formulate the strategies and policies governing education based on Islamic culture, to prepare curricula for various fields of study based on the needs of the society, and to train and to appoint qualified teaching staff committed to the cause of the revolution. Hence, the university were closed for 4 years. The establishment of close tie between universities and theological seminaries, known as Hawza, was regarded vital. Therefore, the Bureau of Cooperation between Theological Seminaries and University, Daftar Hawza و Daneshgah, was established. Many universities' lecturers were sacked, many teachers as well. Some were invited to attend various discussion sessions held by the aforementioned Bureau in Tehran on Qom. The required staff were selected from among dedicated Muslims. Being a dedicated Muslim and being a practicing Muslim means being not only a Muslim, but also a 12er who shows her or his loyalty to the regime. Upon reopening the university, not only all students were not allowed to go back to university, but also some courses such as music, dance, they were dropped for religious purpose. Some other, as hotel management, were dropped because they felt that they are useless. Such fields such as agriculture and engineering also were dropped for women. Male medical students were prevented from specializing in gynecology and other women-related specialists. Motherhood and wifehood, one more time, were considered the most important task for women. The biological and psychological differences between two genders were stressed. Therefore, they were trained for different responsibility. No university, if possible. You know Iranian women now. They don't give up. Although anyone who had completed higher school education could enter to university and could apply to for admission to higher education institution, the following criteria were used to selecting the good students. The candidate should be, I don't go to the one that is common between Ismailis and non-Ismailis. I just go the one that may affect Ismailis. The candidate should be Muslim and believer in the concept of Velayat Faqih. The candidate must be a practical Muslim. They must successfully pass all the selective process. What is the selective process? You need to pass the academic bit first, and then people would come and knock the neighbor's door and ask about the person, how kind of person this is. Are they a practicing Muslim? And by practicing Muslim means whether they go to mosque and do praying. Ismailis don't go to mosque, we go to Jamaat Khana. So definitely here we are not part of those people who can enter university. So what happened to Ismailis? Ismailis didn't give up. And this is in addition to other discrimination that Iranian women actually faced, like quota during the Iran-Iraq war. So there was some quota for people who participated in war, and definitely male had more right and portion of going to university in comparison to women. And also the family of them, they had also more right to go to university, get more chance to go to universities. and Ismailis automatically, they were not there because they may not attend. Some Ismailis attended the war, but not all of them. If they were obliged, they attended the war. So what they did to overcome the ideological and political barriers in the professional lives and social activities, as well as gaining tertiary education, particularly during those periods when they faced direct and indirect discrimination, one practical method has been hiding their face and exercising self-censorship in public. They found some strategy to successfully overcome numerous barriers that were and still are devised for selecting candidates to study at university and to be admitted to particular job. Despite the fact that as an Ismaili they were experiencing the ideological test or screening, they could prevent them from pursuing, prevent them from pursuing higher education and entering labor market. They continued and obtained university degree. I'm very pleased to let you know, when I did my research, 80% of the people who actually I interviewed, they had already tertiary education degree, and they were working full time. Therefore, the existence of the discrimination by religion has not discouraged them, but put them in a new situation. They tried to find a way to overcome the barriers, both as a woman and as Ismailis. If one way was blocked, they tried another, and a third, and a fourth were necessary. Discrimination could neither discourage nor marginalize Ismaili female citizens. Rather, it made them creative and thoughtful female who found their ways to become socially and professionally active. Although employing taqiyya was crucial to the respondents' success, it was not the only reason for the educational success and achievement. Half of participants of this study, more than half of the study, as I said, 80%, had university education. It would be been impossible without their parents' commitment, encouragement, and support. Their commitment was so deep that they made important sacrifices, such as moving and migrating from a small city to another big city, from a village to town, to just conceal their identity, and then nobody, neighborhood, they don't know them, and if they come and knock the door, so they don't know they are Ismailis. So, and then they could go to university. They did such a sacrifice. So what is now between empowerment and the relationship between higher education? I just would like to quote some of this saying that they said, these people that I interviewed. I'm a dentist. I'm a doctor. I'm an accountant. I'm an English teacher. I studied maths. I studied biology. I'm an engineer. I'm a mechanical engineer. I'm an electrical engineer. I'm a doctor. And I'm an architect. What is missing here? What job is missing here? Teaching. They can't go as to be a teacher because teacher is just for practicing Muslim, for dedicated Muslim, that although Ismaili themselves, they consider themselves Muslim, but they are not regarded dedicated or practicing Muslim. Therefore, they can't go. I was a teacher myself back home, but you cannot imagine how much suffer I had and practice that, and I hid my religion to go to universities and live with the snatcheries in a dormitory, in a room with 4 people. And I had to not only hide my religion, but also know all the rules and regulation of a snatchery better than them. I was more, if they asked me, I was more religious than them. They asked me to pray for them when I was doing my dua, because mine had to be longer. And I had to do theirs, and then I do my own prayer. So they would tell me, oh, how patient you are. Can you pray for us? So that has been something that happened to us. But if we want to go to university, if we want to study, so that would be something that we have to tolerate. What did I study? Maths. Why? I loved it. But always I was worried that why there is inequality between women and men. I thought that I can sort out all equality and help women to be as equal as men, particularly in patriarchal society like Iran. But thank you. But when it came to the time of university, I didn't have that privilege to go for something that I liked. I had to go for something that I can take care of myself and I can take care of my family if they need it. And even today, I'm very grateful to His Highness that gave me this opportunity to come here and study the course that I wanted to study. And now I did on Ismaili women. And I'm going to, because I know I have just 5 minutes, Dr. Halani showed me, I'm just going to show,
You've got 2 minutes.
2 minutes now. Okay, so I'm just going to give you what happened to Ismaili women regarding their empowerment. So one thing that I defined, I very much loved Ronald's and Laila Kabir's definition of power. They mentioned that power has got different forms: power over, power to, power, and then power with, and power within. I just linked that power to the achievement of Ismailis and linked it to empowerment. And I also translated or used this definition for what happened to Ismailis. And I can say by power two, it was something that they could, sorry, Leila, it will be more than 2 minutes. So yes, they will actually, by power over, they will control power. They will create new possibility and actions without domination. A sense of whole being greater than the sum of individual, like when a group tackles programs together. And finally, the spiritual strength and uniqueness that resides in each one of us and make us truly human. Considering the above definition for the term power and the achievement of Ismaili women, the following statement can be made. From their viewpoint, access to tertiary education brought achievement in terms of human capital and human capability that overall facilitated the process of empowerment. Empowerment has over and covered outcome. Empowerment is a process that cannot be measured directly. It varies from one person to another, depending on an individual's circumstances, such as social, political, cultural, and economic condition in which they brought up and where they live. It depends and it differs. A linear relationship between education and women's empowerment does not exist. Women's chance of gaining better position of power, whether inside the private sphere or the public sphere, are not necessarily dependent on their level of education alone. Empowerment can be about bringing into the process of decision-making those who have been outside this process. Empowerment can be about participation. It may enable women to participate in various spheres, including politics, economics, etc., or all other fields. It can be even more than participation. It may give women the confidence to see themselves as having the right and capacity to not only act, but also influence decision. Therefore, according to this notion of power, those who are empowered can perceive themselves as able and entitled to make decisions. Indeed, they will be able to maximize the opportunity available to them without constraint. To sum up, they will also become aware of their own interests and how those relate to those of others. Access to tertiary education hence helped Ismaili women to gain control over their lives. They developed power over their destiny because they could remove all obstacles in their way, even when the requirement for entry to some work or area, some work area or tertiary education to some field of study were very difficult. The women of this study can be considered as power who have developed their power wit, because the process of socializing within this university has helped them to share and socialize with other classmates from various backgrounds, particularly with women or other people or outside the Ismaili community. They develop power from within, because during or after graduation from university, they gain consciousness about their status in society, in their communities, and they gain power to live with their life as they wished. They develop knowledge and skills that help them to negotiate with others, and the mean they will be able to develop power too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maryam. We now have our last speaker, Dr. Shenila Khoja-Moolji, and her topic is Writing as Witnessing, Reimagining Displaced Ismaili Muslim Women's Lifeworlds through Archival Marginalia.
Great, thank you. I want to again begin, as everyone did, by thanking our organizers for these 3 extremely generative days. This is the last paper of the day, and so I feel the pressure to be really exciting, and so I'll try to do that. But I'm also glad that it comes after Professor Virani and Professor Herijage's papers, because I'm hoping that my book can begin to make a small contribution towards the scholarly agenda that they outlined today. Okay, so this chapter is part of my forthcoming book, Rebuilding Community, Displaced Women and the Making of an Ismaili Muslim Sociality, in which I tell the story of how Nizari Ismaili women recreated religious community, or Jamaat, in the aftermath of multiple displacements over the course of the 20th century. I draw on 95 oral history interviews with Ismaili men and women, 75 women, 20 men, who fled either East Pakistan or East Africa in the 1970s and headed to West Pakistan, today's Pakistan, the US, or to Canada. In the project, I ask, how do people survive dislocations? How do they remake their social and spiritual life worlds? What types of material, cultural, and emotional work do women in particular undertake to regenerate a sense of self and community? What can a closer examination of women's activities teach us about lived ethics, the formation of religious communities, and about practices of care? Studies about refugee placemaking often focus on how refugees transform their built environments, particularly public spaces, so that it reflects their needs and aspirations. Viewed from this lens, diasporic Ismailis have carved their place along migratory routes, establishing Jamaat khanas and social welfare institutions. But I extend the concept of placemaking to illustrate the fashioning of Ismaili community in the diaspora, not only through modifications of the built environment, but also through the more hidden and intangible practices of women. These include efforts from cooking for congregants and cleaning Jamaat khanas to packing lunch for a traveler, helping a family find housing, telling a mu'jiza story to pass on spiritual knowledge, compiling cookbooks to transmit the foodways of ancestors, and writing novels to conjure Ismaili history. And one of the novelists featured in my book is right here, Sakina Karmoli. Placemaking, in this more capacious sense, can account for how religious communities are made in the here and now, as well as symbolically. This deep look into women's practices also gives us an understanding of how they practice their religion in the everyday. In addition to prayers, which are often the focus of studies on Muslim piety, we encounter women enacting their faith through mundane reproductive activities of cleaning and cooking for co-religionists. These are care practices through which they not only express their faith, but they also try to work out what their faith actually is. This book thus sets out to theorize an Ismaili ethics of care. This project is personal because it's inspired by my grandmother, who in 1971, along with my mother, who was 12 years old at the time, had to flee East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, due to civil war. Nani was already a widow at the time, caring for 5 young children while working at a restaurant. The war, as can be expected, jolted this family, which was already on the brink, always on the cusp of poverty. But when Nani and her family landed in West Pakistan, Karachi specifically, representatives of the Ismaili Jamaat formed an infrastructure of care around them. They were first taken to a makeshift refugee camp at the Garden East Jamaat Khana and were given food and clothing. Hot meals, 3 hot meals, my mom reminds me often. An ad hoc Ismaili volunteer committee composed of displaced people themselves had come together to help other displaced families. Members of the committee helped Nani find housing and subsidized the family's rent for over a year. The image that you see here is of the building where my Nani and her family lived. 6 people in a studio apartment, and I took this image in 2019 as I was conducting field work with the apartment's current occupants, who are Ismaili refugees from Afghanistan, also being supported by the Ismaili Jamaat. The volunteers also helped enroll my mother in an Ismaili-run boarding school and provided tuition fees for several months. In the meantime, an Ismaili woman helped my Nani find work as a housekeeper for another woman. The lives of displaced, working-class Muslim women like my Nani, a widow with 5 children, engaged in the informal economy, working as a domestic aide, always on the brink of falling deeper into poverty, are often not recorded within national or even religious histories. And also excluded from our histories is the labor of everyday Ismaili women who supported these displaced co-religionists. And so this book emerges from my desire to capture the lives of these women, and more importantly, to write women into modern Ismaili history. Since we have limited time today, I will just read a couple of excerpts from this specific chapter. When I visited my Nani in Karachi during summer vacations, she would make me bhel puri. 10 years old me did not particularly like bhel puri because I was not allowed to have the tamarind and cilantro-based chutneys that usually go with it. But even at that age, I knew that there was something about cooking and eating with my grandmother that deserved to be respected. So when she told me to wash the potatoes, I washed. When it was time to mix and measure the puffed rice with onions, I mixed. I would say that her bhel puri was delicious, unparalleled, like nothing I could eat at home in Hyderabad. She would smile, not a full beaming smile, but a half-clouded one. She insisted, "Write it down, beta." For Nani, cooking was an everyday practice, its knowledge passed down orally. She did not have any formal schooling. Write it down was not something she could do, but asked of me so that you don't forget. Bhel puri originated in Gujarat in India, but traveled with Ismaili Muslims as they migrated within South Asia and on to East Africa, fleeing famines and wars. It accompanied my Nani through multiple displacements over the course of the 20th century and a life of poverty. When her husband died young, she supported her 5 children, making bhel puri as a cook at a restaurant in Dhaka. Bhel puri, mostly eaten as a snack by the middle-class customers of the restaurants where she worked, was often the only meal that she and her children could afford for days on end. When the 1971 war between East and West Pakistan uprooted her family, she began making bhel puri in Karachi for a small canteen run by and for Ismaili Muslims at her local Jamaat Khana. When Nani and I made bhel puri together, she would tell me about her past work as a cook, her tin-roofed home in Dhaka, and how she sneaked her way into Karachi. Food, of course, is not only about nourishment. It tells us stories about where, how, and when it was created, and about those who consumed it. Its modifications and fusions reveal diasporic encounters. It transfers memories of women past and their care labor. It is tied to political economy and social class. In women's food practices, we can also glimpse how the mundane act of cooking can be a spiritual practice. My Nani often said, "I don't use lal mirchi in my food because Imam Sultan Muhammad Shah advised against it." My mother imbibed that lesson and does not use lal mirchi either. So in this chapter, I consider women's cooking practices and in particular cookbooks written by displaced Ismaili women who fled Uganda to uncover how they engage in memory work and placemaking. Cookbooks were often the earliest texts penned by Ismaili women in the diaspora, yet they remain an understudied archive. While cookbooks have often been dismissed as lacking in serious historical value, feminist scholars have turned to cookbooks as offering us access to details of minoritized and quotidian labor often undertaken by women. Studying cookbooks can particularly be revealing, as through them, women participate in creating imagined communities, they share ideological values, and recruit new generations to heritage practices. But the choice to study cookbooks is also not without controversy. While cooking is a paradigmatic care activity, it also naturalizes women's place in the home and the kitchen. Cooking can exploit women, as the labor of food preparation is often unremunerated and undervalued. However, as we will see, by engaging in care through food preparation and later by documenting and publishing their activities in cookbooks, displaced Ismaili women in Canada seized subjectivity. These women authors wrote the cookbooks to build bridges in the diaspora, to engage an audience that is beyond their community, and to leave a historical record. Accordingly, as gender studies scholars Kumar and Sanyal argue, we may be well served by considering domesticity, and cooking in particular, against larger social and discursive structures. Food served to others under conditions of enforcement, for example, is experienced differently than teaching younger women how to make dal quickly so they can balance their responsibilities at both home and work, or cooking biryani for Kushali as an act of seva for the imam. Thus, without denying that kitchen work can be a means of exploitation, I consider Ismaili women's cookbooks as aesthetic artifacts of their placemaking practices through which they took care of fellow and future Ismailis. I'll talk about one cookbook in the chapter, and in the book there are 6 or 7 that are considered, but I don't have too much time. So Nurbanu Nimji was born in Canada in 1934, shortly after her parents, like many other Ismaili Muslims, had migrated there from Gujarat. By 1974...
Where was she born? Not Canada?
Kenya. Sorry. Yes, she's from Kenya. By 1974, however, her father and husband had lost their business to nationalization, and the family feared that Kenya might follow Idi Amin's example of expelling Asians. Nurbanu's family therefore made its way to Calgary to begin life anew. And I know many people here know Nurbanu Auntie, so this is important. Yep.
I use her cookbook extensively.
Oh, okay.
Me too.
That's awesome.
I use it extensively too.
Oh my God. Okay, so this is special for me that way. Nurbanu, then already in her 40s, busied herself supporting her young family as well as the displaced youth of her community. She went on to write and self-publish 4 volumes of her cookbook between 1986 and 2015. And in the chapter, I follow the arc of the cookbooks to illustrate the transmutation of her community-making practices. Not long after arriving in Canada, Nurbanu's husband was appointed as Mukhi of a newly established Ismaili Jamaat Khana. When a man is appointed as Mukhi, his wife typically becomes the Mukhiani and is tasked with tending to the needs of female congregants. In fact, the suffix of ma, an Urdu term for mother, is often added to the title of Mukhiani in everyday Ismaili vernacular, making the Mukhiani the mother of all congregants. In this capacity, Nurbanu facilitated the settlement of many newcomers from East Africa who continued to move to Calgary throughout the 1970s. In the newly arrived cohort were recently married Ismaili women who wanted to cook heritage food items for their young families and new Jamaats, but could no longer turn to their own mothers for help as they did when living in the multi-generational homes of East Africa. They instead reached out to Nurbanu, their mother in the context of the Ismaili Jamaat. Nurbanu's daughter, Khadija, recalls that a lot of them didn't know how to cook. So they, would ask mom, can you teach us this and can you teach us that? So my mom said to them, why don't you get a group of people together and then I can show you all at once and then you all will know it. Nurbanu offered cooking classes to this and other cohorts of Ismaili women for 10 years before she self-published her first book. Khadija recalls this decision as being intimately linked with Nurbanu's pastoral care work within the community. She says, "One of the girls told my mom, as a Mukyanima, you should make a book. You should put all of this into a book and it would be so handy for so many people." The cookbook is aimed at the uninitiated, a cook who is nonetheless an insider of sorts and thus not entirely unfamiliar with the ingredients or dishes. Instructions are short and direct and assume some prior knowledge. So in the first cookbook, it says, "Cook potatoes until it's cooked." But by the time she's in number 4, it's like, and it talks about texture and it gives you a sense of smell. And so one of the arguments that I make is that when we track her cookbooks, we can see how her attention shifts to the second generation, the future grandchildren, as she often used to say. So Nurbanu explains that she wrote the cookbook to ensure that the foodways of her people are not lost in Canada. She says, "A dish prepared from a spicy touch is the mirror of a culinary history of a people." Nurbanu's efforts to document the food history of Ismailis is similar to the work of other diasporic women too, who wrote cookbooks to ensure the transmission and cohesion of their cultural groups. Examining A Treasure for My Daughter, a popular Jewish cookbook that similarly presents itself as a guide to inherited foodways, Andrea Eidenberg observes that cookbooks of this kind were not just recipes, but occasions for women to promote certain food customs and shape the ethno-religious identity of their communities. These functions are visible in Nurbanu's first volume as well, as she uses recipes to tell stories of where Ismailis have traveled and describes the specific tastes and textures that they have acquired along these journeys. And the chapter does a close reading of the recipes, which I won't go into right now, but I want to make an additional point about her cookbook. The 1987 volume structures social occasions along with the dishes, revealing the social values that Nurbanu wishes her readers to maintain. For instance, she includes sample menus for a full meal for invited guests, a buffet dinner, and a tea party, signaling the expectation that women would want to or should want to maintain traditions of hospitality even in the diaspora. While this volume contains only a few photographs, the ones that are displayed present full meals prepared for large groups instead of dishes in isolation or plated as individual servings, implying that commensality is essential for family cohesion. These values become all the more significant because the early life of many displaced Ismailis in Canada was marked by hardships, as my oral histories show. Often men and women held multiple jobs, and even children had to work after school. Some struggled with transportation and lived far from Jamaat khanas, and thus had limited contact with fellow Ismailis and family members. The cookbook, then, to some extent, is an aspirational space through which Nurbanu imagines social gatherings that might bring family members together so they can heal together. Nasim Teja, a young woman who attended Nurbanu's classes in the 1970s, explained her own effort to replicate Nurbanu's recipes, hinting at its reparative effects. She says, "I moved to Calgary in my early 20s with very basic knowledge of East Indian cooking, newly married to someone who loved food, but without a parent to teach me dishes I wanted to learn. I realized quickly that she, Nurbanu, was an amazing cook and always willing to share her delicious recipes. She taught us all the tricks to make these dishes turn out the same as hers. I really appreciated her wanting to share all the knowledge with me." Unquote. There's a suggestion of knowledge transmission taking place here that includes not only the recipe, but also the techniques of reproducing family by nurturing it and holding it together through heritage food. Nurbanu's efforts to ensure that young Ismaili women could cook heritage foods might be seen as reproducing or naturalizing women's gendered roles in the domestic sphere. But instead of viewing domestic labor as necessarily subordinating women and drawing on Maryam's notion of empowerment, we might do well to see Nurbanu's efforts as reflecting the care ethic implicit in her role as Mukyanima. If, as the note from Nasim Teja suggests, teaching the tricks of cooking serves a restorative and healing purpose, then we can understand Nurbanu's cookbooks and cooking classes as emerging from her desire to ensure the spiritual health of her community. Newcomers would be better able to settle in unfamiliar environments if equipped with the skills to reproduce a taste of home and to confidently experiment with new ingredients. And so in the chapter, I show how her attention shifts to second generation Ismailis who have no food memories from India or East Africa. She introduces food modifications, and all the while trying to introduce the second generation to the lives of her Ismaili ancestors. So just zooming out, my approach to the lives of displaced women in this book and broadly has been informed by the work of decolonial feminist philosopher Maria Lugones, who has theorized faithful witnessing as a method of transforming illegible subjects into recognizable one. Faithful witnessing, according to Yumaira Figueroa, offers a lens through which to recognize the assertion of humanity and dignity by women in moments that would otherwise be unseen or ignored. Through the book, then, I witness and write the often unseen and ignored Ismaili women into modern Ismaili history. I argue that women's placemaking activities that took the form of reproductive tasks have been necessary for the propagation of Ismaili sociality. But instead of deriving the value of women's care work by pivoting to the domain of economics, I highlight its reparative potential in the aftermath of displacement. We are thus able to learn about how women have lived their ethics, rebuilt jamaats during flight and displacement, and sharpened our theorization of an Ismaili ethics of care. Thank you.
Thank you.